Hello, welcome to Rye Brook Focus. My name is John Mugno, and I'll be your host for today's session. Our topic today is coyotes, and our guest today is Dana Goen from the Wolf Conservation Center in South Salem, New York. Dana is a wildlife outreach specialist with a degree in wildlife conservation. She is very knowledgeable about coyotes. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me, John.
Well, Dana, there have been some coyote sightings around the village of Rye Brook, and residents have called into the village government seeking guidance. So perhaps maybe we should start with some basic information about coyotes. What are their physical attributes? What are their typical behaviors, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So coyotes are a local wild canid species. So basically, a close relative to dogs or to wolves. They're the largest local canid that lives, in the wild around here. Although when I say large, they're not especially large. They're only about 20 to 45 pounds on average, typically much smaller than most people assume, even when they're looking right at them. A very common comparison that I get is that they look bigger than my German Shepherd. A lot of it is just their characteristics, their fur, their long snout, their pointed ears, bushy tails, things like that. But they're usually only about half the size of someone's typical German Shepherd. In terms of their typical behaviors, coyotes are technically crepuscular animals, which means they are typically most active at dawn and dusk. However, that behavior will really change seasonally depending on what their needs are during each season. For example, if they have pups, they might be active a little bit more during the day, and often in avoidance of human activity. So they might be adjusting their typical activity schedule if they are trying to stay away from people.
So that someone sights or sees a coyote in the daytime is not necessarily a sign that the coyote is suffering from some illness. That could be fairly normal behavior.
Right. And what I always tell people is, we go out at night. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with us. So if we are seeing a coyote or even a raccoon, for example, out during the day, it does not necessarily indicate that there's something going on. You'd have to look at a number of other behaviors to really kind of make that determination.
The other thing people mention is the howling by coyotes. Why do coyotes howl?
So a common misconception is that when people hear coyotes howling, they think that they're hearing them make a kill. That's a frequent report that I get in my email or in my voicemail box. I hear coyotes killing animals behind my house because they're howling every night. The reality is, if you think about how coyotes have to hunt, they're typically sneaking up on their prey. And if they howl, they're letting the prey know that they're nearby. So coyotes typically only hunt as individuals or maybe in pairs, and that's because the prey they're going after is small. So they go after small mammals for the most part. So rats, mice, squirrels, rabbits, there's not a whole lot for them to share. So if they started howling after they've killed a small rodent to let everyone in their family group know, hey, I've caught dinner, by the time the family meets up with them, that food is gone. So in reality, what's actually happening is when we hear them howling, it's more often just a family reunion. So coyotes are very social animals. They travel with their family members. When we refer to a pack, it's typically, the breeding pair, which is the parents, and then their offspring. And that offspring might be from various years, but they're typically all siblings. So because they're not always traveling together, like I said, they might not be hunting together, or they might just be exploring on their own. When they reunite, they often break out in these really loud, raucous howls. So it's kind of like you're overhearing a loud party. It's just family members really celebrating, hey, we're back together. And they can get a little rowdy, but it's usually just that.
Okay. And do coyotes generally seek to avoid people?
Yes. So coyotes are naturally very wary of people. But they often choose to be around people because there's typically a lot of food sources. So where there are people, there are rodents, whether it's mice kind of in our dumpsters or even in our homes, or rabbits kind of nibbling at our gardens. There's going to be a lot of food nearby. And there's also typically water sources. So we kind of accidentally create a lot of really valuable resources for a lot of wildlife. So often coyotes are kind of choosing to be near us because we provide a lot of resources, a lot of good habitat. And in some cases, it might be because there's not many other places to go. But, they typically try to avoid us. They really don't want to be around us, but they might start to unlearn that fear if we're not giving them any reason to, maintain it. So if we are feeding them, whether it's intentional or not, they're going to start to lose that fear of people. Or if our interactions with them are just neutral. So the example that I sometimes give is, if you're standing there looking at a coyote, if that coyote suddenly charges you, you're going to be probably understandably pretty frightened. That's definitely an unnerving situation. But if that coyote just stands there and looks at you and then walks away, you might think, oh, okay, there was nothing wrong with that interaction. Maybe coyotes aren't that frightening. Now, if you flip those points of view, if that coyote is looking at you and you suddenly start making a ton of noise and you start running after them, they're going to start to think that people are very frightening. And they're going to take that information and, teach their pups or, stop approaching people. So I want people to, haze coyotes, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or, just kind of prevent these sort of neutral interactions. I do want people to admire coyotes. I think they're really fascinating. But, we want to reinforce to coyotes that people are loud, we're unpredictable, we're a little bit frightening, and that they should keep a pretty safe distance from us.
In some, you want to convey the idea that people could be dangerous, even if they're not.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of it is us just putting on a show. We're just yelling, clapping, being just kind of making the situation a little uncomfortable for them because most wildlife does not appreciate loud noise or unpredictable movements. And so that's kind of what we try to recreate.
And one conclusion I draw from what you just said is something people could do is to make sure they secure their garbage, which has to be an attractive nuisance with respect to the coyote. Never
Right,
mind
yeah.
humans.
Yeah, coyotes are generalists, which means that they can occupy a lot of different habitats. They can eat a lot of different food. They're not terribly picky. So they're carnivores, which means they're mostly eating meat, but they can eat an omnivorous diet, so fruits, vegetables, things like that, and they can scavenge. So, they're not going to turn up their noses at dead animals or at rotting fruit in your garbage. So that is one thing that we can really do is eliminate attractants. Whether it's securing our garbage cans or making sure that we're cleaning off our barbecue grills, or of course, just not leaving food garbage out and about for coyotes to have easy access to. It's just that easy access kind of encourages them to be nearby. So that's one pretty simple thing that we can do as community members is just, clean up after ourselves so that we're encouraging our wildlife to stay wild.
Okay. And people are generally concerned, obviously, about their pets and to their children. When a coyote attacks a pet, or let's not use the word attacks, when there's a coyote-pet interaction, I would think it could be because the coyote sees the pet as food. It could be small, or the pet could be large, and it sees the coyote as a threat and tries to engage it. Any other ways of looking at that?
No, those are pretty much the main kind of interactions that we might have in terms of there being conflict. You're exactly right that sometimes with small dogs or with cats, coyotes might see them as potential prey because they're sort of right around the size of what a coyote might be able to, successfully handle. And, coyotes, they don't know which animals are appropriate or inappropriate to consume. They have no idea that, this will be very heartbreaking for people. They're just trying to survive. So that's where it kind of comes to, falls to us as our responsibility to, keep our pets close and supervised whenever possible. And then when there's interactions with large dogs, they tend to see them not as prey, but instead, as you said, as potential, competition, a threat to their resources. And so those interactions are sometimes them being a little bit. So when coyotes are having these kind of interactions with larger dogs, it tends to be because they see them as competition or a potential threat to their resources. And so it's less a predator-prey interaction and more them being defensive of really what they need to survive. There was one more thing I was going to say. We're obviously going to have to cut these little bits out, but well, it's gone. I lost it with the coughing thing.
Look, the village has asked people to report concerning behavior with respect to coyotes. Mm-hmm. What should people interpret as concerning behavior?
I would say, so to me, I think concerning behaviors kind of fall under two categories. We have signs of illness in coyotes and habituation. So with illness, that might be stumbling, foaming at the mouth, seeming kind of unresponsive or unaware to things around them. And then sometimes you might see some uncharacteristic boldness as well. With habituation, you're going to see a lot of that uncharacteristic boldness. So habituation is when they're kind of, learning that people are not frightening or that people are even a source of food. So when folks are feeding them. So you might see approaching people, biting or nipping at people, or not responding to prolonged hazing efforts. Some coyotes, it takes a little while. That first interaction, it might not really click to them that, oh, that's kind of something I should avoid. But if we are kind of sustaining those hazing efforts, really yelling at coyotes, clapping our hands, making noise, blowing whistles, things like that. Even, something I sometimes recommend is if you're, on your back porch or something like that, in your garden, you can sort of take the garden hose and just kind of squirt it in their direction, things like that. I certainly don't recommend throwing things at the animal, but towards them, just kind of reinforcing in their minds that they should stay away and keep their distance. But I would say if you're seeing either of those, now it's happening again. So if you're seeing evidence of either of those, instances where you might maybe have illnesses or habituation, those are situations where you should report it. But if you're just seeing coyotes out and about, that's not necessarily grounds to report. It's just, evidence. We have coyotes here. We all know it. But if we're just seeing them, even if we're just seeing them during the day, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to report it.
Okay. And what should people do if they feel they're menaced, if they feel they're menaced by coyotes?
So this is where hazing would come in. So I've kind of touched on it a couple times, but I haven't really defined it. So hazing is reinforcing an animal's natural wariness of people. So we do this through loud noises, exaggerated movements. So like I said, yelling, clapping, blowing a whistle, an air horn, things like that, really just kind of reinforcing that fear and frightening them away. So if you see a coyote somewhat close to you, I would say, start hazing. But the key is that, and this is partly why we do these community-wide efforts, is that we want to start hazing before there's an issue, before we start seeing that maybe this coyote is becoming bold. We look at it as kind of a proactive measure rather than reactive, although coyotes can relearn that fear of people. So it does work in somewhat of a reactive sense, but we really want to get there ahead of time. So, using all these hazing methods and then telling people, sharing this information with other people so that you're not the only person in your community or in your neighborhood that's doing hazing, that we're all kind of doing it. And so those are kind of things that you would really do. You would start hazing, you would start removing those attractants, supervising your pets, keeping them leashed, things like that, so that we can really eliminate or at least reduce potential for conflict with coyotes.
Okay. And if the hazing is ineffective, then you need to go to these other methods where, as you say, you don't throw things necessarily at the animal, but to throw things near the animal. You just keep reinforcing the message that they shouldn't come closer.
Right. You can start kind of escalating those hazing efforts. Some coyotes, if they just see that you've seen them, that's enough to make them run. Some, it takes some yelling. It just depends. Just like there are some people that are more bold than others, or some that are really cautious, and the tiniest bit of confrontation is never going to happen again. It really kind of depends on the individual, but as a general rule, just kind of hazing as effectively as you possibly can is going to be the best method.
Okay. And you've noted elsewhere, this I thought was a very interesting point you'd made elsewhere, is that neither lethal nor non-lethal removal from the local environment is an effective strategy. Could you explain that?
Right. Yes. So lethal removal would be, killing coyotes. So if we're seeing coyotes, I do see that some towns will do this when they start to get more reports of just sightings of coyotes. Sometimes they hire a contractor to come out and start trapping coyotes and then killing them. And people often say, okay, well, I don't want that. Can't we just relocate them? So for one, I'll say that relocation is, not exactly a humane solution, because what relocation does, let's say we have a coyote that's exhibiting problematic behaviors. Well, now we've just moved that coyote and those potential issues to another location. But, at the core of it, that coyote has now been dropped into likely another coyote's territory. It's very unlikely that we're going to find vacant territory. We just wouldn't know. So that coyote has now been placed into a very vulnerable situation where they're on their own. They're an interloper in this other coyote's territory, and they want to get back to their families. So they're at great risk of conflict with those resident coyotes. And in their attempts to get back home, they're likely going to be, not only passing through other coyote territories, but crossing roadways in areas where they don't necessarily know how to find the resources they need. So often when animals are relocated, unfortunately, it's, it just kind of prolongs their death. They're put in a very kind of sad situation where it makes survival very difficult. So that's why relocation wouldn't work. But in terms of removal, whether it's lethal or non-lethal, what happens is when you have a typical stable coyote pack, you again have that breeding pair, which is mom and dad, and then you have their offspring. And they, in that group, only the breeding pair, only the parents are permitted to breed. So no one else in that family is allowed to have pups. If they have the desire to have pups, they have to leave and find their own territory and an available mate. And the reason for that is, in that family group, they're all family. So if they start interbreeding, you're going to have some challenges. You're going to start to see, inbreeding effects. But on top of that, you're going to start to see, a real impact on their resources. Their territories can really only sustain so many animals in that ecological niche, which is really their role in the ecosystem. And so if you start to have too many animals, you reach what's called the carrying capacity in that ecosystem, where it reaches a breaking point where animals run out of what they need to survive. And so if coyotes, just keep breeding and breeding and breeding and not expanding their territory, they're going to run out of food, and you're going to start to see starvation and other issues. So they keep their populations very, very stable. But if we start going in and just indiscriminately removing coyotes, so let's say, someone goes in and they kill half the pack, or maybe even just a third of the pack, The remaining individuals, they don't necessarily stick together. Although their emotional bonds are very strong, they've just kind of been through this major trauma, this major disruption. And so often the rest of that group will really disperse. And you start to see individuals that maybe wouldn't have been part of a breeding pair, they're now on their own. And so the logical thing is to start a pack. So you might have half of that original breeding pair maybe breeding with a new individual. You might have offspring that maybe they were 2 years old, they were at breeding age, but they were going to stay with their family members for a few more years. Now they're on their own, so they start breeding. And so you start to have more breeding pairs in that same given area. And they also have larger litter sizes. And so we call this the rebound effect. You have kind of this temporary dip in the population, and then this rebound where the population starts to really boom. So again, what we want to do is, support our local coyotes by, coexisting with them. And one way we do that is keeping them wild, hazing them. And then, if there start to be conflict issues, address those as they come. But in the meantime, we want our resident coyotes to be our resident coyotes, because when you also start creating this vacuum where other coyotes from outside the area come in, because now there's vacant territory, because that pack has been completely disbanded, you have new individuals, and those individuals might not understand the rules of the area. They might be younger and more inexperienced, so maybe they go after pets or they go after livestock. And so sometimes you see an increase in conflict directly after you have kind of these removal events. And so again, it's really crucial that we just kind of appreciate our coyotes that are here and keep them wild and discourage any kind of habituation.
Yeah, the way you just talk about coyotes, I think you're really saying they're quite intelligent creatures with kind of instincts to stay together with their siblings and their parents.
Exactly.
How long do coyotes live?
So it depends, but typically on average about 4 to 6 years. Young pups, survival is quite difficult when they're young. So probably only about 50% of pups reach their first birthdays because there's just so many threats. Whether it's access to nutrients or, when they're young, they're vulnerable to predators. There's just a lot of different things that can happen. But once they kind of reach adulthood, the average is about 4 to 6 years.
What are the predators in an environment like southern Westchester? One of our neighbors caught on their camera a bobcat. Mm-hmm. I suppose that would be a predator with the pup as prey. But it can't be too many, I wouldn't think. But
right, yeah, bobcats certainly could prey on infant coyotes, but they're much smaller than adult coyotes. Bobcats are another animal that people often think are much bigger than they are, but they're about 15 to 25 pounds when they're fully grown. So there are some people's house cats that are about the same size as bobcats. But yeah, I mean, naturally, there would be wolves, mountain lions. These are animals that, historically would prey on coyotes, but those animals have been eradicated. We don't have wolves or mountain lions in this area any longer, unfortunately. So in their absence, we do have kind of an imbalance in our ecosystems, and coyotes somewhat provide some of that balance, but they're certainly not taking down healthy adult deer, so they're not impacting or evening out the deer population in the way that larger predators would. So without those large predators, coyotes are kind of top of the food chain. You might occasionally see a black bear prey on a coyote, but I'd say that's likely pretty rare.
Yeah. So what advice would you give for people in this? And now they're obviously, they don't have your level of knowledge, they don't have your level of understanding. They sight a coyote. Would your advice be to be fairly relaxed about it because hazing works very, very frequently? Or would you say if hazing doesn't work after a minute or two, go to something more extreme, like throwing things near the animal or something like that? What's the advice? I think people are looking for some type of advice about how they should behave when confronting a coyote or feeling they're being confronted with a coyote.
I don't want anyone to do anything they're not, comfortable with. Having any kind of encounter with wildlife, can be exciting. Whether that excitement is positive or negative is up to the individual. But I will say that, hazing as a general practice is very effective. But I certainly don't want people to feel that they're in an unsafe situation. So, trust your instinct, but know that conflict with coyotes is pretty rare. We see a lot of articles and things like that of coyote bites, and it sounds like they're happening all the time. But the reality is, this is a Humane Society statistic, you're more likely to be killed by a champagne cork than you are to be bitten by a coyote. So if that kind of puts it into perspective at all, these actual attacks, quote unquote, are pretty uncommon. But that being said, coyotes have teeth. Anything with teeth has potential to bite. And so you just want to be aware. You want to kind of be aware when you're out in these situations, or given whatever time of year it is. If it's summertime, that might be pup season. And so you just kind of want to be aware and, have these, tools in your tool belt. So tools being, the knowledge of how to haze and things like that.
So let me ask you a kind of a scenario. You're walking around the corner of your house to the backyard. You turn the corner, you see a coyote, let's call it 50 feet away. Should you immediately initiate hazing behavior, or should you do nothing?
I would say haze at that point. Likely at that point, that coyote has not spotted you. And so sometimes it's good to just, say, hey, I'm here. I've been in situations like that because as you can imagine with, just being a curious nature nerd, or in various field positions I've been in situations where I've seen wildlife and sometimes surprised wildlife. And as much as I, as an individual, would love to stand there and really observe them and see what's going on, once they're within a certain distance, and I would say 50 feet is pretty close, I want them to learn that, I'm not just kind of someone putting out good animal loving vibes. I'm a person and they should fear people. And so I have been in situations where all I've wanted to do was watch that coyote, but I've said, nope, I have to haze them. And so I've just taken a step out and said, hey, I can see you. And usually the coyote runs off. But yes, I would say in those situations, if you were to turn the corner and a coyote is there, certainly make noise. One thing I would say not to do is run. Running can, occasionally trigger kind of a chase response in animals like coyotes. And you don't want to, of course, be in that situation, but it also kind of teaches them that people run. And so they might start to increase that barrier between people. If they approach, they expect that you're going to move further back. And so we really want to kind of make it very clear that we're not going to back down. We're here. This is our yard. And that they should either come back when no one's around or just avoid it altogether.
And if you encounter a coyote, let's say in a more open space, you haven't just turned a corner, and you start your hazing, should you back away from the coyote as you haze?
I would say stand your ground. This is not something that I would necessarily encourage other people to do, but I have walked towards coyotes to haze them. Again, making it very clear that, they just should not be around us, at least in that close proximity. But, again, do what you're comfortable with. If you would prefer to just make noise as you calmly back out of the area, fine, do that. But you want to make sure that you're not just kind of silently running like prey. We would be very large prey for coyotes. It's not likely that they would be chasing you to eat you, but we just want to make sure that we're not, reinforcing to them that they should or can get closer.
Right. Okay, well, this has been very interesting, Dana. We appreciate very much taking the time to appear on our program, and let's hope coexistence persists between people and coyotes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.